So now we want to talk about the idea that even though the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education unanimously that the 14th Amendment means that the doctrine of separate but equal established in 1896 was a violation of the U.S. Constitution, particularly the 14th Amendment, and therefore segregated schools across the country should be integrated. Um, and even though it was a unanimous ruling and it was a recognition by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who knew the limitations of the powers of the judicial system, arguing that it needed to be, and wrote the opinion, the majority opinion, the unanimous majority opinion, which I had you read and still suggest you take a look. All of those things were critically important, but they weren't enough. They were necessary but not sufficient, to use the terminology that we use in social science. And so we want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which other parts of the United States government and the state governments were unhappy with this and how they tried to block the actions by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so one is other members of the federal government also opposed this. Many in Congress were against the ruling. Particularly notable was the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto was signed by all members of the congressional delegations from, and I list the state abbreviations on the slide, and that would be Alabama, our friend Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia. Because I spent some time in the South, I went to Duke University and the University of North Carolina, I can start to say some of those with that Southern drawl that's affectatious for someone who is from the land of Lincoln, from Illinois. It is the larger idea that all members of the congressional delegation from those states, both members of the House of Representatives and U.S. Senators, both the U.S. Senators, signed this manifesto, arguing that the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education was something they did not support. There were only 3 Southern Democrats who refused to sign the manifesto. That was Al Gore Sr., Al Gore, who was a vice president of the United States. His father was a senator from the great state of Tennessee. Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who became a future president. Kefauver, who was also from Tennessee. So, but beyond that, all Southern Democrats signed the manifesto, saying their displeasure with the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court and arguing and trying to suggest ways of making changes to undermine the ruling. It's an important thing to recognize that the U.S. South at that time was dominated by Democrats, in large part because the individual who freed the slaves, Abraham Lincoln, was a Republican. And so for a long period of time, the Solid South referred to Democrats. And so when we talk about that, all but 3 of Southern Democrats signed this manifesto, that is a large number of people. We now have it flipped the other way. As people have noted in some of their discussion posts already, there has been a change in terms, a little bit about that when we talk about political parties and courses. They'll talk about that. And so now most of the South is controlled by Republican politicians. But back then in the 1950s, it was mostly Democrats. And so they argued a number of things in the manifesto, but one of those that I want to really point out is their argument that's there on the slide, that the unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. So it seems a bit disingenuous that in fact it was something that this system of segregation was supported by both races. It was supported by the intimidation we saw along the lines of literacy tests, poll taxes, ways in which the KKK and the way it rose and would intimidate individuals who would try to change the system of segregation that existed throughout the South, would try to intimidate people from leaving the communities or stopping them from doing the things that would change them. So it is not 90 years of patient effort. Instead, that's a misunderstanding of history. And so the other thing to recognize, despite the ways in which they wrap themselves in being so self-important and self-aggrandizing and feeling hurt and put upon, is the role of federalism. And so what they argue to say that this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in and of itself is unconstitutional. And they argue it's unconstitutional because of arguments you saw with Dr. Haas's discussion of federalism, and from the textbook as well, is that the 10th Amendment barred the federal government from intervention in education policy. There's nothing in Article 1, Section 8, which is a power of Congress to do these things, and that's the power that was mostly granted to the federal government, the listing of powers, were there. The enumerated powers were those that were given to the federal government, specifically to the legislative branch, and there's nothing that says that they have a right to intervene in terms of education policy. Education policy, as Dr. Haas pointed out, was one of those that historically has been part of the reserve powers. The states have those powers to do as they see fit, and so if they want segregated schools, they should be allowed to do it. It's also the reason why she argued part of this is the idea of states' rights. Although you have theoretical arguments as to why states' rights and why state control of policy might make sense, it is also a way in persuasively, and this is a further example of it, that states' rights can often be used as a code word for talking about things along these lines, of talking about that states' rights was really used as a principle, particularly by those who wanted to maintain things like a segregated society in their schools, but also in terms of voting. So that sent a message that as we argue, if you want civil rights to move forward, you need to have all branches of government on the same page. It was clear that they weren't on the same page because you had the legislative branch clearly articulating in this manifesto that they were against the ruling and that they weren't inclined to make any progress to help the Supreme Court enforce its ruling. So the other part of government that had some concern about this was the states themselves, particularly in the South, but it is important to recognize that throughout this period, the challenges to school integration came throughout the country. In fact, Boston had some considerable animosity and some concerns. And as the video that I ask you to take a look at the end of these lecture slides, John Oliver talked about the role of school segregation in modern society, that the most segregated schools are not in the South. The most segregated schools are actually in New York, in New York City specifically, bastion of sort of liberal ideas and things like that. And so it's an important reminder that even though we often talk about the South, and it was the southern states that clearly led the charge, there were many throughout the country who were opposed to school integration. So the states themselves wanted to delay implementation of the ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, and one was called massive resistance. And so that is the term that was given to a plan by Virginia, the U.S. Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia and his brother-in-law, who was a leader of the Virginia General Assembly. So it's not just two folks on the street who are saying in their bedrooms or on the street that we're angry with this. These are people who had considerable amount of political power, and that they wanted to introduce a system of actions and laws to stop school integration, and it was called massive resistance. And also revisiting the idea of federalism is that they became little laboratories, that the attempts done by Virginia, when successful, were then adopted by other states. They saw that Virginia was being successful, and their terms of success are ones that we're going to take a look at are pretty horrifying, but their success in terms of slowing down the integration of public schools was something that they saw as a success. We may be against it significantly and morally horrified that was success, but that was the view they used. And so we saw that different states could try different policies and learn from each other about how to delay implementation of the ruling from Brown versus Board of Education. And so some of the examples of the things that were done were, for example, entire school districts were shut down rather than integrated. So if in fact a particular school district was demanded to integrate, and so what happened, so taking a step back, is that when the ruling from Brown versus Board of Education came down, the logic of it meant that every single segregated school would have to be integrated immediately. But that's not how the states instead turned around and said, no, well, our school district is different than Topeka, Kansas, or that in Delaware, or that in South Carolina, or those in Virginia that were actually in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Those are different. They were clearly violating the 14th Amendment. We are not. We actually have chalk for the chalkboards for African American schools and other absurd things. And so this delaying tactic that said to the U.S. courts, make us. And so if people would go and challenge and say this school district or this school is in fact violating the 14th Amendment exactly as Brown versus Board of Education, and they would have to do a separate court case to do it, then the school districts would employ these ways of slowing things down even more. So for example, schools and even school districts that had been asked by the federal courts, specifically that school district or that school, to integrate their schools, they would turn around and say, we're closing the school, we're closing the school district, because you can't integrate schools that don't exist. And so they would close the schools for as many as 2 school years, that there would just not be any public education that was provided. Or There was an indirect way of doing it, is that Virginia and other states would pass laws that would deny state funds for integrated schools. So if a school were integrated, it wouldn't have any resources. And so it would mean that they were an integrated school but didn't have the money to actually pay the teachers or to provide the education. Furthermore, state tuition grants were given to white students to attend private integrated, but the same was not provided to African American students. And so you had state funding for individuals white individuals who could be going to their local school, but that thing has been closed because it's been forced to integrate, so they closed the schools. And in order to allow them to have some education, as they could go to a private school that would be subsidized by the state government. State tuition grants were given to whites. And the most extreme example, and this was one that wasn't done in Virginia, it was done in, is that if someone asked a judge to integrate the public schools, that mere act in and of itself demonstrated that that individual was insane and therefore could be placed involuntarily into a mental institution because of just asking for integrated schools. And it just shows the extreme ways in which the states were willing to drag their feet and to stop this from occurring. And so it demonstrates that the states were not going to go quietly into that good night. They weren't going to integrate their schools. So much so that the U.S. Supreme Court needed to revisit this in a court case called Brown 2. We typically call it Brown 2. It had an official name, but we call it in 1955. The U.S. Supreme Court knew that they had ruled in 1954 and saying that the integration of schools should happen. And in 1955, they turned around and said that integration must be done with all deliberate speed. And there's some discussion about what that phrase meant. When you hear it, all deliberate speed, in the way I was taught it, is that it was a demonstration of the frustration by the U.S. Supreme Court saying, we have ruled, we mean that all schools that are segregated need to be integrated with all deliberate speed. But others heard this and interpreted it in a different way, that the term deliberate can also mean a slow movement. Some saw this as a signal that the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the limitations of its powers, and even though it had ruled, it was willing to allow the states to do these sort of foot dragging. At the end of the day, we don't necessarily need to solve what all deliberate speed actually means, because the reality of it, de facto, on the ground, is that the states were allowed to slow down the implementation process. And in fact, it wasn't going to be the U.S. Supreme Court alone in its rulings that would actually lead to school integration. It did require the executive branch and then the legislative branch for there to be real change. And so the next part of this lecture, we want to talk about the actions of the executive branch, the power of the sword we had talked about. And then we want to talk about how Congress finally got involved, and that's the power of the purse, the money. Once fiscal federalism was used as a way, as a weapon, to force those places that had segregated schools to integrate their schools, then you saw real movement. And so that's the next step of the argument.